Okay, it
Live.
looks like we're live. Yay! I don't ever want to start until it tells me specifically that we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. This week's topic is names and titles. But I should mention that we have a guest author next week. Actually, it's going to be same bat time, same bat channel. But our guest next week is Deborah Ross, who is a very, very extremely cool person, and she's going to tell us about her world building in her new trilogy, which is called, oh shoot, I just read the last one, and now I'm not thinking of the name of the first one. It's called The Seven-Petaled Shield, and I just finished reading it. It's really, really cool. So we'll talk all about that next week, and I hope that you guys can be here. Anyway, so today's names and titles, and we've done names before. We've talked about sort of the feel of names, but we haven't really gotten into titles all that much. And I wanted to see if we could also kind of explore some of the social implications of naming. So yeah, so let's see where we start. Well, okay. Why is this a really, really important world building topic? Because names and titles tell you an incredible amount about where you are. And in fact, the very first sequence of words in your book is the name and title of somebody. You learn a ton about the world in just those words. So,
Which can be awkward if you're. It can be awkward if the titles don't match the expectation.
oh, well, so let's, before we talk about not matching the expectation, let's talk about what kind of expectation we're setting up, right? So,
Right.
So what are we talking about here in terms of, and I think you're right about expectations. Expectations are really important. Because let's say that you use the word king in the first sentence. Some people are going to have a complete medieval scenario chunked into place just by you using that one word. And everything after that is either going to conform to or defeat their expectation. Right? I mean, it's kind of amazing the way these things work. The ability to bring in a whole world with one or two words is just unreal. So, king is one of those words. Let's expand it a little and say, okay, depending on the name of the king, we get another set of expectations. So, King Henry is going to give us a very different feeling from King Midas. Is going to give us a very different feeling from King Terandi, right? But the component world that comes in with it is going to be slightly different based on each of those names, right?
Right.
The first one we're in England, second one we're we're suddenly in Greece, and we have to revise our expectations, and then in the third one we think, oh, well, we're probably in a medieval scenario, but it's fantastical because I've never heard the name Tarandi before. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And if it's a word if it's a name you've never heard before, but it happens to look kind of ish, like King Niall, that's actually an Irish king. But people could go, well, I'm not sure where that's from, right? On the other hand, you've got in a way, what you have is you have this 3-point 3-point. I call it that. Basically, it's like an arc, but it's like a micro arc. So when you put a piece of information out there, right? You set up an expectation in the user's mind, and then with the second one, you confirm it. Okay? And then if it appears again, then you can either twist it one direction or twist it another direction, or you can continue. But once you've had 3 instances of a medieval thing, people are going to be like, okay, we're medieval now. And then after that, they're going to say, but you told me it was medieval, and why am I seeing things that aren't medieval here? So really, it only takes 3 data points, which is pretty crazy, but true. Anyway, all right, so let's talk about some other things. Kings are not always there. So, okay, so what do you do if you don't want to have the expectation of the king thing? Well, you pick a different word, right? I had a king in Cold Words, but he was not the king. He was the majesty, right? That's a word that we associate with a king, but he isn't his majesty, right? He's just the majesty. So I basically took king and substituted majesty in for it, using majesty as a noun, and in fact as a proper noun rather than using it as a what it ordinarily would be. And basically, it's a way, changing a word like that is a way to signal to a reader that we're not in quite the place that you expect. It could either be a fantasy world or it could be a science fictional world, but it's going to be it's sort of like a waving a little flag that says, watch out for things that are different because this title is different, or this name is different, right? All right, so why don't you guys tell me a little bit about some of the things that you've done? Have you guys used special have you guys ever invented a titling system or anything like that?
Yes.
Got it. Woohoo!
Okay. In Spectra's End, and it gets a little mathy. We're not actually using a math system, but the way the hierarchy in the world works is you have the benefactors and chosen, right? And this really is like kind of playing a little bit with that whole idea of the chosen one, except that the chosen are a whole big bunch of people that come from every village. Mm-hmm. But we have the benefactors, and they're like basically the mentors of the chosen and the people who keep things running. And then at the head of all of that, you have the prime benefactor, who is the kind of the person. So instead of feudalism or feudalist feeling, there's no kings or queens or any of that. You have this other set of titles. Mm-hmm. And it's just meant to indicate where people fall and what their functions are, mm-hmm, meant to be in this culture.
Yep. And so how does it get used, Reggie? How does it get used? Are they used as titles, or are they used as nouns?
They are used as titles. And then the names are just they're the ones given by their family. So, like, you have Miguel and Betty, which, Shay's been reading this, and she doesn't like the 1950s feel of some of the names. But
so are we looking at benefactor Betty, or are we looking at Betty who is benefactor, or who is a chosen, right?
She would be a chosen. So the chosen really are only called by their first names. And it's mentioned that they're chosen when you're hearing their story, but it's not necessarily a title. It's an indicator of a group of people. When it's a benefactor, you would say benefactor Miguel, right? So it's benefactor and then their first name. Okay. Now, and then the person who's in charge of everything, the prime benefactor, her name is never used in conversation.
Right, right. Because in some ways, naming, if you're, the ability to call somebody by their name indicates a certain degree of intimacy with them that isn't allowed in certain social contexts.
Right.
Yeah. So, and that I think is something that is worth pointing out because it's true across a lot of different contexts. Okay. Okay. Who else has a system? Or do you want to? Do you have one more thing to say, Reggie?
Well, I was going to mention that in terms of you were talking about intimacy with that, and I absolutely agree with you. But in this particular story, I would say that also it's the familiarity, intimacy factor of being able to use a first name also is an indicator of power, and the more reliant people are on your first name or diminutives of that first name, the less power you have in the structure. So the power factor being referred to only by her title indicates, of course, that she has the most power in this particular world.
Right, and that is actually a good point, and I'm glad you mentioned it because intimacy and power are actually not the same. It's not the same measurement, and they are often sort of parallel to each other, but they're not the same as each other.
Right.
So it's like when you use tu and vous in French, right?
Yeah.
It used to be much more about power, and now it's actually much more about intimacy than it was before. Solidarity, I guess, is what they would call it, more than intimacy. Yeah. So, but anyway, so even though both of those are involved in a choice between titles or between tu and vous, and it may influence whether you want to risk using somebody's name or not. They're not precisely the same, but either one can be taken into account with that. So okay, great. So let's look at a different model if we can. Anybody else have one they want to mention? It doesn't have to be something you've written. It can be something that you think of from.
I'm playing one that's the society's very age stratified, and so there's some very formal terms of address depending on what age group someone's in. But then there's also the informal social intimacy layer of how people address each other, and I'm trying to play with the interaction of that. I don't have good ranks or titles right now. They're just mother, sister, and daughter at the moment, and I don't particularly like that. But
it's sort of a generational feel.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting that you would bring up family names because I know that there's always the question of what you call somebody whose name you don't know, right? And in some cultures, you would call those people by family names. So you're making me think of Japan, Amanda, because let's say that you're interacting in Japanese with somebody and you don't know their name, right? You'll tend to call them by a name as though they were a member of your family, but it will also depend on what their perceived generation is. So women of a certain age will be called grandmother, and women of a different age will be called aunt. And women of a younger age will be called older sister, right? Typically not younger sister, which is kind of interesting, but so yeah, older sister or aunt or grandmother, depending, right? Depending on the age group. And I'm thinking about what you would call a little girl. Probably a little girl would also be big sister. So, yeah. Little boys are occasionally referred to as boku, which actually means I, which is almost like the person speaking is sort of putting themselves into the little kid's point of view. But that's only done with little boys, not little girls.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I've seen in anime, like, when a character doesn't know, like, another character's name, they'll call him, like, old man or grandfather, and then they're horribly offended. Like, I'm not that old.
No, that is actually a pitfall, and you don't want to fall into it. So when in doubt, you use aunt.
But that kind of that makes sense. And some of the anime, they do it just to kind of like piss them off, you know, like OG-san or something, like old man, and they're just like, I'm not that old. You know?
Yeah, you can deliberately do that to piss people off. It's true.
Ma'am often works for that purpose.
Oh, ma'am. Yeah. So okay. So yeah.
Oh, God. Yeah.
In English, actually, the appellations for women are much more complicated than the ones for men. And because they have these extra implications about whether you're married or not, which is really annoying. But I think nobody calls. Well, actually, no. It's interesting. So if you call a guy that you don't know Mr., it has a very different feel from calling him Sir.
Yeah.
Right? And I think Mr. for me has a whole load of social implications that I would feel uncomfortable using, but Sir is a little bit less. It feels more generic to me because perhaps it has a larger selection of contexts in which it can be used. You know, and then you've got Miss versus Ms. versus Mrs. And I don't think Mrs. Well, you see, Mrs. as in Mrs. So-and-so is a very unmarked thing to say, but Mrs. that they would spell M-I-S-S-U-S has a whole set of social implications that come in with it, right?
Yeah.
They all feel very different.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about it now. It feels really anachronistic, the whole system. Like I think about how I use that in the day-to-day. I mean, obviously in school systems, you would still call your teacher Mr., Mrs., Miss. But other than that, I don't often encounter people calling each other with that signifier.
Mm-hmm.
If that made any sense.
I think it's almost used like less and less, really.
Yeah,
everybody now, like in the U.S., everybody just runs around calling each other by like their first names anyway.
And then, of course,
Hey,
you.
Yeah. Hey, man. That's like your alternative to sir is like, hey, man.
Or dude.
Dude.
No. Yeah, I know. Yeah, dude. Like the only advantage of living in California just about is that you can like unapologetically use dude to like get someone's attention.
Be like, hey, dude.
I've done that at like Comic-Con. I was like, dude, like somebody he dropped his poster, and I'm like, dude, and like not even thinking
it's gonna work, right?
like not. I didn't even really think about it. It was just like that seemed like the normal thing to do.
Right.
You know, and my friend is kind of like, oh my god, you're calling him dude.
Well, because, you know, people are coming in from out of state, right? What are you going to do?
No.
But, yeah, so it is kind of interesting, right? So you've got this regional twist to these appellations.
So what kind of expectations do unrecognized titles bring up, because I've got a set of family titles, one that indicates the ruler of the country, and then I made up some. There's Lord Ankute, who's the head of the house, and then there's Sena, which is the heir, and Ser, who is the other, and any other sibling. And the title might become Sena. Sena, what is it? Sena Kira. Well, actually,
Okay.
Kira isn't.
How do you spell Sena?
S-E-N-A. I probably need an accent or something. Or
No,
different spelling. Yeah? And then Sarah is S-E-R. S-E-R. Sorry.
Okay.
But then there's another thing called, and then counselor should be pretty self-explanatory. That's not a member of the family. But then I've got this thing that's Per, P-E-R, which is not useful, who is not a member of the family, but has been sort of adopted. It's not.
Okay.
It's of the house.
Right.
But there's no, it's definitely not a brother. So it's not a sibling, but it's not, it's not the child of the head of the household.
Right.
So.
Well, so anytime you're jumping in with a title of any kind that somebody's not going to understand because they can't possibly ever have heard it before, you have to support it contextually, right?
Right.
It's just like any other word that you might use that is an alien word that nobody's heard before, right? So
right.
If you're in a throne room and the person is sitting on a throne, you can call them whatever the heck you want, right?
Right.
Now, obviously, that's not going to be the case all the time.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah. This.
So basically, I guess what you could say is if you're trying to support these kind of family-like terms contextually, you can always put somebody in a situation where they're not sure whether to call this person that, right? Like, well, I mean, he was close to our family, kind of like a brother to me, but it was really a formal situation, so she didn't know whether she dared to call him Per, for example, right? I mean, when you have conflict or indecision, those can be really great opportunities for explanation, because in a situation where there's conflict or uncertainty, you actually have a perfect opportunity to have a person in whose head you are visiting explain what's going on to a certain extent. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes.
And so if you can tune the situation correctly, then you can kind of actually get more mileage and actually free yourself up to explain a couple things that need to be explained. Right? So
right.
Disagreement will do it too.
Yeah. Well, you're going to declare me what exactly does that mean? What are you calling me? Why? Sort of question, because the guy doesn't know what this means.
Exactly, and in Cold Words, I had my human character calling Ruli his friend. You say, "Oh, you're a good friend," and Ruli's reaction was, "I don't know. What does that mean? I'm not sure I'm okay with you calling me that because it may have implications I'm not comfortable with." All of a sudden, you have an opportunity to get your readers questioning what the meanings of the word friend are and what those implications might mean for somebody who is not like you, right?
Right.
So yeah, that.
What are the other? Oh, there's another naming convention I have that's a little different. I don't know, and it's sort of indicates it's a thing that came from another culture, from another country, and there are personal names that are linked by relationship names. But there's one that means spouse, and one that means child, and one that means parent.
Right.
So if you call someone in by that relationship in one context, where is it? Gartha del Fuente, you're emphasizing that Fuente is Ngartha's. No, that Ngartha is the parent of Fuente, and that's why you should respect Fuente. If you do the other and you say, what is it? Fuente, Terra, Ngartha, then you're saying, Ngartha, this kid is your responsibility, and you are responsible for the behavior of this child, and speak to him in context. So emphasizing the other direction of a relationship. I was looking for plurals, and I don't have a form that recognizes both parents. It's different from ter. Oh,
you're making me think. You're making me think that it could be a really useful piece of research to get people going and looking into kinship terms in different societies on Earth, because there are a lot of different systems out there, and they can actually give you ideas on a lot of levels. So yeah, very, very interesting. All right, so if you guys will humor me, I will tell you a little bit about the way that the naming and titling works in Varan, because it's actually kind of complicated. And so it should be kind of, I mean, hopefully it'll be fun and give us a bit of fodder for our thinking in terms of what in terms of our naming and titling system. So okay, so Varan has 7 castes. Okay, and back when I was first inventing it, I made up all these names for the castes. So a caste name is like your last name, except it's not. It's your first. Okay. I decided that your caste identity was the most important thing about you to these people, right? And so that would be the first name that people would say. So, for example, a person with the first name of Tagrit, who belongs to the Grobel caste, is not Tagrit Grobel. He's Grobel Tagrit. Okay? And Grobel also serves as a title for him. Okay? So if you have a person who's a member of the servant caste is called Imbati. So you have characters whose names are things like Imbati Kwarme, Imbati Zinta, Imbati Aloran, right? Their friends will call them Aloran, right? So within the caste, you don't actually, and here's the thing, everybody's got a caste name, and that is supposedly the most important thing about them. But within the caste, nobody cares, right? Because everybody has the same caste name. So inside the caste, you never use that name. you just use the person's given name. And it is really weird, and in fact, I make a point of saying that it's really weird if one servant calls another servant Imbati Aloran. Because that's like, why are you referencing my caste name as if you were not even in my group, right? It's a very weird thing, and one of the characters does it, and the character who is on the receiving end of this is going, something really off about this guy. Why is he calling me Imbati, right? Don't we know each other here? So it's not just what you call people, but when you call people that, right?
Yeah.
And then there are other distinctions within the different castes. So, for example, inside the noble caste, they have 12 great families, right? And the 12 great families are really politically important boundaries, even though they're all really, really inbred. But the distinctions are really considered important. So, my character Tagrit is of the first family, and so he's, to anybody else in his caste, he would be Tagrit of the first family, right? His friend would be called Many of the second family, or Goan of the ninth family. This is how you refer to people within the caste. The Imbati, who are very sensitive to, who are the servants to the nobility, and they're actually not lowly servants. They're very, very high-powered assistants and advisors and this kind of thing. So they are actually conscious of both kinds of distinctions. So an Imbati who's talking about Tagrit will not call him Grobel Tagrit unless they're talking just to another person in the servant caste. But say they're talking to somebody else who's in the nobility, they'll call him Grobel Tagrit of the first family because they know the first family distinction is what's going to be important to the person they're talking to, and yet they're not of a high enough rank to be able to use his name without the title.
Yeah. I like that kind of
when you get digging into this stuff, there is a lot of complexity, and actually one of the really big cues to whose head you are in when you're reading in one of my Varan stories is how that person refers to the other people in the room. Because in fact, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll be writing along in an interaction in one person's head, and then cut the chapter off, and in an instant switch to another person's head, but continue the very same interaction. And suddenly, the room is occupied by the same people, but every person is going by a slightly different name. I mean, it's easy to get it wrong, right? But when you get it right, it like really makes me so geeky and happy. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, now that I got all the titles right, you know. Because yeah, you just really don't have, yeah. So I guess that's the main thing about the way that the Varan system works, because it mostly, yeah. Oh, and person that you don't know on the street, since we did cover that topic, person you don't know on the street is by law going to have their caste marked. So, of course, if you don't know them, you refer to them by their caste name alone. And that depends on you being able to recognize the caste mark. So, yeah. So basically what you have is you have these legally mandated caste marks that people have to be able to recognize so that they know how to talk to each other, because there are things you have to say to people who are higher caste than you, particular greetings that you have to use and this, that, and the other, that you don't really have to worry about if you're of a higher caste, and addressing them. And in fact, if you're a member of the highest caste, it's almost like caste doesn't exist. Because you don't have a caste mark. That's the only caste where there's no caste mark. And you interact with all the people who are in just your group, and pay as little attention as possible to anybody else. But you don't have to use special ways of addressing people or anything like that. You just call them, well, you just look for their mark, call them whatever caste name suits you, and then move on. So, hi Brian, welcome.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
I can. I'm not sure if Emily's still here. 'Cause she's awfully quiet, but anyway. Yeah. The complexity of the Varan system is such that I would be tempted to give you an example, but I'm not sure that that would help the discussion more than continuing on with other aspects of this topic. Oh, great! Thanks, Emma.
No.
I did notice the trombone, and while I'm a fan of Holst, it might be a little distracting. So I appreciate that.
Wow, that's a long chat I just wrote.
Yeah, you did write something quite long, Morgan.
We're all staring at it now.
In
It's like,
college, everybody used first names for everyone. Students called faculty, staff, and administration by first name. Social expectation. I see.
Excuse me.
Oh, okay. Great. This is great. Perfect. Thank you, Morgan. Okay, so there are certain cultural contexts in which using a first name or a sort of a solidarity indicating nomenclature is actually the thing that we should do, right? That was cool. We got a little run there.
Musical sting.
So let's say that you're in a cultural context where solidarity-based language is expected. And then it becomes marked for you to use a more formal way of speaking. And when I say marked, it just means it's like not the default, right? So if you've got an established cultural default within your community that you're going to call everybody by first name, then there would be only very specific reasons why you might choose not to call somebody by first name, right?
It's like when your mom uses your whole name and you know you're really in trouble.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Exactly that, because there is that intimacy between you and your mom, and your mom's likely to call you, Obi baby bee, googly girl, or whatever it is, right? If she suddenly decides she's going to call you by your whole name, oh my gosh, that means distancing herself from you, and usually that doesn't mean anything good.
Sarcasm. I like that.
So then the question becomes, what kind of reasons might there be to use the distancing move of using a formal term? And and yeah, it can be insulting, or it can be trying to distance yourself so that you can prepare yourself to hurt the other person.
Indicate the nature of the conversation. If in that system that I was using, sometimes the son will call his father, and sometimes he'll refer to him as Lord Ankute. And it's sort of, am I talking to him as my father? Do I want him to respond to me as my father? Or is this a formal request I'm making of him? And sometimes the father will insist on using one term or another to indicate. But so far he's just used his son's name. He hasn't said explicitly, Sarah Kira.
Mm-hmm. But I think you're right there, and that's a really good point. I want to put it explicitly in words, that when you use a particular type of term, whatever you choose, you are invoking a particular social role. So the term that you're going to use is going to depend on what relationship you are invoking with the other person, right? And if you have multiple relationships with the person like that, okay, so for example, we have some friends in Japan, and the girl is in her mom's class, okay? But when they're in class, she's not allowed to call her mom mom, and her mom is not allowed to call her by first name. So it's funny because they have to call each other last name son and last name sensei, right? In class. Whereas when they're out of class, they can say, oh, mom, oh, honey, or whatever, right?
It might be useful to use in this country. I had a friend who was in middle school, was in her mother's class. And so they didn't have that distinction. And so there wasn't anything to say, well, just because she's my mom doesn't mean she's, treating me differently, doesn't mean she's grading me differently. And there was nothing to show the other students that they were making distinction between the relationships.
Yeah.
And so it sounds as though that would be a useful thing to do.
Yeah, it does sound useful.
I know someone who homeschooled, and when they were having class, she had her kids address her as Miss Page, which was her middle name.
Oh, that's interesting.
To kind of structure that this is classroom time, it's not family time.
Interesting, Glenda.
That's kind of neat.
Okay, so tell me about job titles, Shay.
Well, I was thinking about that when you said, like, so-and-so sensei, and we don't have that so much here, but where, like, the job title ends up as, like, your name, suffix, or prefix.
Yeah, Japan definitely has that.
Yeah, but the only thing I can think of in America is where usually, like, political officials, you get, like, congressman so-and-so, assemblyman so-and-so, president, but that's something that you could easily put into a story or a novel idea, is that sort of addition and, like, what jobs get a sort of suffix or prefix and what jobs don't could be important.
Yeah. Actually, the odd thing about the Varan system I was telling you about before is because the castes are separated by their economic functions, it's almost like a job title at the same time. So yeah, absolutely. That is a very interesting. I am distracted by a cat behind Brian. That's a cat behind Brian.
It's gone now.
Yeah, there was something else actually that I also wanted to mention, and that is, I guess you could call it the regional or caste implications of particular surnames. And I don't just mean caste. Economic. Like in the U.S., we'll say, oh, she's a Rockefeller, right? And that doesn't just mean I know her last name, right? It has very specific implications about this person's position in society and etc. That's something that can be, like, a particular name can be a dead giveaway about where a person is from, or whether they should be treated well. Yeah. So I'm thinking about Japan and the ETA group, which is not supposed to be a distinction that's recognized anymore, but nonetheless it still is. And when it is, it's generally based on where a family is from and sometimes what their last name is, because that last name is associated with a particular group. Does that make sense? So you've got these social distinctions that are trying to be erased, but that they're remaining in a sense in the sense of place and in the names that people have. So that, you know, I don't know. Am I making sense?
Well, I'm thinking here about, I mean, right now, most of our issues around ethnicity are visible on people's faces.
Mm-hmm.
But in earlier in the 20th century, a lot of ethnicity was in people's names.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You couldn't really, I mean, you know, if somebody dressed up in whatever was the contemporary attire,
Right.
you didn't know whether they were Polish or Irish or
Right.
whatever. But when you heard their last name,
Right.
Mhm.
And I think and I think that, yeah, that's one of the factors that went into a lot of families changing their names when they came to the U.S.
I was just typing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. We all had the same thought at the same time. That's because we're on in the ball. Yeah. So.
There isn't also. I mean, there were people who changed their name, you know, to hide ethnicity or to you know. But there's also the instance of people coming into Ellis Island who were given names. The immigration authorities gave people names, which were not always nice names.
No.
Such
they're
as
like
the
too hard to
origin
pronounce or spell, and they're just like, eh.
The origin of the Goldwater name, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah. So exactly, and in fact, those are the two sides of the name changing thing, right? That some people chose to change their names, and some people didn't choose to change their names, but had their names changed for them, which is kind of awful.
And my grandmother's name on the manifest is Emily, and that's just not her name. But her mother was no doubt exhausted when she went through, and entirely possibly forgot which of her 6 children she was trying to name. Especially as she was pregnant with the 7th, and was really not happy about it. But
yeah, so Reggie's got a story.
I do. My last name, now my last name is a traditional German last name, but 3 generations ago, on my dad's side, when they came over on Ellis Island, they simply misheard the last name, and like, of course today it's Lutz, but originally it was Luzzi, L-U-Z-Z-I, so for Italian. Heritage. So, but if you hear that, and I do have some German heritage also, but that's not where the name comes from.
You know, the German versus Italian thing is actually a really big problem. Especially when you're tackling things like bruschetta.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, that's a little bit of a sidebar. Yes.
in the sidebar.
In the sidebar, indeed. I was going to say, we're reaching the end here. So I think, but what I was going to say is that people choose names, and certain names tend to be given to certain types of people. And so names have these huge implications about what ethnic group you're a part of. You know, we went on a trip at one point to Utah. This was before we had kids, so it was a while ago now. And we were in, gosh, I believe we were in Provo, and we were meeting some of the many relatives of some of my relatives, and we discovered that there were quite a number of young women named things like Lakeisha and Latasha, and these were not possessed by the kind of people that my husband and I would have expected to have names like Lakeisha and Latasha. But we were told that these were actually First Testament biblical names that had been, that were being used by the Mormons in Provo. So I may have gotten the names themselves wrong, but basically these were names that to me immediately said, well, I should expect this face to be African American, right? And instead it was, you know, Utah Mormon young ladies, and I was like, nice to meet you, you know, and you don't say anything, you go, I just learned something new, right?
But Letitia, I'm thinking the 19th century, Letitia was a perfectly good English
I'm not
child
thinking of
name.
Lakeisha. I'm thinking of Lakeisha with a K.
Oh,
I was
Lakeisha.
thinking a Q.
or the K sound is what I'm referring to. It could be.
Okay.
It could
Oh,
be
yeah, that would do it.
In my head.
I think
So I wonder if I heard
these days, I
Letitia.
think spelling
because
is one
that's
of
what I
those things with names that gets. I don't think there's hardly a name that doesn't have 8 variant spellings at this point.
Yeah.
That's true.
You know, so yeah. But when you choose names for kids, you do it very, very carefully, and then there's that sort of thing where it's like, you know, if you call your son J. Trevor Mortensen, he's more likely to grow up to be a billionaire or something. But yeah, I mean, we haven't even been able to go into all of the sort of lifestyle prognostications that get implied in the meanings of names on the baby name site. But I'm going to let people go off and research that on their own.
Oh, no.
But I have seen numerous articles saying, well, your name is totally going to decide your future.
Yeah.
No. No, it's not.
Is it?
Well, there are people who change their names for reasons of superstition and so forth, so it does happen. People are given names based on superstition, and then they decide for various reasons to change or alter their names for similar reasons.
Yeah, that's a good point. Why would you change your name?
Disconnect from the one you were born with, disconnect from the family, or your past in some way, or your previous body.
Yeah, there are examples with transgender people. Obviously, there's you know, it's a very significant part of adopting the new identity is changing name.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, or it could even be a cultural norm in some groups that your childhood name, you don't know who you're going to be, so you have a childhood name and an adult name.
Yeah, and in fact, yes, there and there's the whole thing about true names. I'm thinking of Wizard of Earthsea. They had the childhood name, and then you had this point in your life when you were given your adult true name, but you never actually used it because if you used it, somebody would have power over you, right? Obviously, this is a big topic.
Yeah.
Wow, oh gosh. Right. You You've changed.
It's Amina. It's Amina the startling cat.
Oh my.
Oh, and
Hello.
yes, the other reference there is Spirited Away, where she has her name stolen. And that is actually one of the most clever, little things that I've seen.
See,
Yeah.
that seemed to me very sort of classically fairy tale.
Yeah.
You know, both Western fairy tales as well. There's like guessing the name of Rumpelstiltskin.
Yep.
If you can guess his name, you can make him do something, but you have to
Yeah,
know
I mean
his
that's
real
rooted
name.
in the names have power thing. It's,
Yeah.
Yeah.
if you know someone's true name, you can bind them, control them, whatever. And yeah, Earthsea is based very heavily on that whole concept.
Turned into a cat too.
Yeah, there's cats everywhere. It's cat day. Dance, kitty,
Cats
dance.
are off having dinner.
What are you doing to me? All right, so we are at 4 o'clock. This has been a great topic, and I'm going to wrap up here. But thank you to everybody for coming and for all of your contributions. Next week, as I said, we have a special guest, Deborah J. Ross, who will be talking about her Seven-Petaled Shield trilogy. And so we're going to talk about magic systems and handling languages and all kinds of really neat stuff that Deborah's got going on in her trilogy. And so hopefully we'll be able to see you next week. And I'm going to stop the broadcast.